Joining us now, it's a debut, and I'm very excited to be announcing it. Krystal Ball, she's the co-host of Rising on the Hill TV. Krystal, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm nervous.
So we have so much to talk about, and I just want to, we're going to start with this clip because this clip just disgusts me so much. Like it actually pissed me off. And I have to tell you, like I have a pretty, not much like actually pisses me off. There's sort of like the, yeah, fuck this person, whatever. This one I thought was grotesque. What is,
this one got you.
You know what video I'm talking about, right?
Oh yeah.
What is her name? Do you guys know her name? Mimi Rocha. Mimi Rocha. And I should say a bunch of co-panelists who are nodding like she should have been responded to like somebody huffing glue outside of Penn Station. But let's check this out. This is Mimi Rocha last week on MSNBC talking about her feelings about Bernie Sanders. And then Krystal, I'm going to throw to you because I think this has a lot of lessons about how Sanders is treated generally.
I think, having Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren next to each other will really highlight, because for me, as, again, I'm not the political analyst here, but just as a woman, probably considered a somewhat moderate Democrat, Bernie Sanders makes my skin crawl. And I can't even identify for you what exactly it is, but I see him as sort of a not pro-woman candidate. And so having the two of them there, like I don't understand young women who support him. And I'm hoping that having him next to her will help highlight that, because those are the people that if I were her, I would want to say, well, why are you supporting him and not me if you're going to choose between the two of us?
Krystal, what's going on there?
Well, in fairness to Mimi, no, just kidding. There's no defense here. I mean, this clip literally has everything. You have the person who right away prefaces the fact that they're not a political analyst. They really have no idea what they're talking about, right? With the insinuation backed up by absolutely nothing that Bernie Sanders is not a pro-woman candidate, when, of course, all of his positions, not to mention 40 years of public service, would tell you otherwise. There's that. There's zero statistical data used to back it up. And then there's also the just gross condescension of claiming to speak for all women, but then also condescending towards the women who do, in fact, support Bernie Sanders. And that all of this passes for analysis on, a very important and influential network. Yeah, it kind of says it all, doesn't it?
It says it all. And it also says that nobody else said, like, hey, do you want to rephrase that? Because you just embarrassed all of us and yourself. Instead, we have, like, Zerlina Maxwell's pumping her head. Like, oh, yeah, that makes total sense.
Or like, hey, even, how about you back that up? Like, you say he's not pro-woman. What do you mean? Would be a logical question, follow-up as, someone who does this regularly. But even her, that she would be asked to opine on this is in itself problematic. But again, as long as you are kind of saying what they want to hear, then they're happy to have you say it and not give any pushback.
Do you think, though, partially what disgusted me so much about this comment, look, obviously I'm a Sanders supporter. I and the larger media reality is that, you couldn't get away with saying this about, forget Warren. You could not say this, I think, about any other candidate on MSNBC without, let alone pushback. I would say a conniption, right? Like this, the kind of casual contempt. But I want to connect it to when she talks about young women specifically, right? Because it's not just this weird, a lot of mainstream pundits, and I think we can get into like the various class reasons and so on, but they have weird psychological fixation about hating Bernie Sanders, right? Like I don't support Harris as an example. We just have different politics, but I don't have a life built around having a weird fixation on hating her the way these people do with Bernie Sanders. But when you talk about young women specifically, and this is just like a statistical overlap, you're disregarding the fact that, yes, a lot of young voters in general support Bernie Sanders because they're disproportionately affected by things like student debt and income inequality. So the contempt she has there accidentally basically extends to the entirety of the American working class. Almost like the hatred for him is a stand-in for a bigger hatred.
Well, and I think you're exactly right. I do think there's something, and I can't quite put my finger on it. There's something about Bernie Sanders that is like a trigger, right? Because he doesn't play by their rules. He doesn't really respect them or, adhere to the traditions they want to see or like play the role that they want him to play. There's a bit of a mutual antipathy there, I think it's fair to say.
Mm-hmm.
But you also have this phenomenon, which I certainly saw and experienced when I was at MSNBC, where the world that they live in, especially, the folks that are up in New York, is a very rarefied world. So, for example, and also, unlike YouTube, where you get instant data on what is doing well, what your audience is interested in, you get comments, you get feedback, like you can see right away what people want to hear about and what they don't, for better or worse. It's actually very squishy, the data in the cable news world. So that allows for people to make all sorts of assumptions about what the audience does or doesn't want to hear. So, for example, when I was at MSNBC during, the run-up to the 2016 election, I was told that the audience didn't care about and voters didn't care about TPP, right? It wasn't interesting. People don't care about it. We're not going to cover it. So, obviously, TPP became one of the central issues. It was one of the most important things that people cared about the most in the 2016 election. But because it wasn't a conversation that was being had on the Upper East or Upper West Side in Manhattan, there was an assumption made that that wasn't a topic that was interesting to people. And I think it's the same. I think there's the same similar dynamic going on here with Bernie Sanders, because if you look at who supports Bernie Sanders, right? Who is makes up the Bernie Sanders coalition? It's disproportionately working class people. It's disproportionately people who do not have college degrees, who are making less than $50,000 a year. And those are just not the sorts of folks that Mimi Rocha, who I'm sure is not a bad person, and I'm sure, is trying to express the best that she can, which she
I'm
actually
not
thinks
sure.
is going on in politics.
I'm sorry.
Well,
Get you in trouble.
Well,
I'll just...
those are just aren't the people that she's coming in contact with.
Right.
So it's outside of her purview of understanding.
I don't want to turn class, I try to on this show talk about class is like a process in the economy more so than an identity, right? And I actually get super skeptical of the way people talk about kind of class as an identity in mainstream media, because all of a sudden it turns into having nothing to do with where you're at financially or professionally. It's all like, oh, well, you could be a multimillionaire, but if you drink, Budweiser, watch NASCAR or whatever, then you have working class sensibilities, which is another delusional way that this stuff is covered in media. But I will say, it just seems
True.
that, there's some recognition, and even though these places still do not achieve it, right? But there is a generic recognition in the MSNBC universe that if you're going to have a segment that deals with women or African Americans or so on, you probably should have some people that actually are from those groups. On the flip, when you're talking about Bernie Sanders, when you're talking about cutting Social Security, or you're saying nobody cares about TPP, it's this inbuilt well, everybody working here's parents could, pay for them to have an apartment where they did it while they did an unpaid internship. It's completely screened out.
100% correct. And it's a reflection of the society at large, right? We have, as a culture, not placed value on class diversity, have not placed value on having people of, from working class or middle class backgrounds in positions of leadership, right? Or as people who have a prominent voice or who have power. I mean, this is a larger cultural issue, but it certainly plays out on MSNBC and CNN and other places, where then you end up with these bizarre segments where, it's like the reporters are going on safari in their own country, trying to figure out what the peasants are really talking about, rather than actually incorporating those voices as voices of authority into the coverage that you're putting out to the country.
So what's the Bernie play? Like this morning I was on, I should say, like, I'm friends with Bree Joy Gray, who's his press secretary. She used to be on the show all the time. I guess now I say too many inflammatory things for her to regularly be on, Krystal. But she's got
a lot going, I think.
The gulag segment was maybe a little controversial. But I was on the podcast this morning on Hear the Burn talking about Bernie and Lula, Brazil, foreign policy. He's built this whole alternative media infrastructure. What do you think, if you were to take a strategic approach to how Bernie deals with the media as sort of like often another impediment, what's the best path there, do you think?
My thinking, and I actually have been thinking a little bit about this, is they've done a great job cultivating the alternative media approach, and I think that's awesome. They need to do that. That's predominantly where a lot of their coalition can be found anyway. So I think that piece has been really smart. But I would be a little bit less careful about doing the mainstream media outlets and, let Bernie get in there and be feisty and call people out when they're being unfair. Make that more of a point of conversation that's happening nationally and not just in alternative media of, hey, how are we covering this election? And are you getting the facts right on Medicare for all? And how are we looking at this issue? And he's a very, obviously, incredibly effective communicator. And the Mimi Rokas of the world aside, people find him really compelling and in his own special way, very charming.
Right.
So I would open the floodgates a bit more and take some more risks and put him out there. I mean, you look at, I thought, and this was very controversial, but I thought that Bernie's town hall on Fox News was one of the better moments of his campaign, because the guy's just fearless. He's not afraid to call bullshit on the bullshit. He's not afraid to do his thing in hostile territory. I think we need to see more of that from them. He's got to be out there a little bit more than he's been so far.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And I'm a little confused looking at that campaign, because I think they are doing a lot right. But to me, two really successful moments, which I could see being controversial, and maybe the more risky thing to do, was when they sent that letter to the Center for American Progress several months ago, like, yo, we're not going to just, you're not going to just attack the guy with bullshit all the time. We're going to come back at you if this is going to just be like a cheap tabloid oppo shop on us. And yes, he did an incredible job at the Fox Town Hall. And why I'm wondering, I think in general, if you got that kind of feedback loop, I do wonder why there isn't more of that from the campaign.
Yeah, and I don't have the answer to that. I mean, I think, he has, rightfully so, a healthy skepticism of the press and, doesn't necessarily enjoy those appearances when he has to go on and tolerate what are oftentimes stupid, uninformed questions that he's constantly having to reframe the premise of, or the kind of horse race stuff that, he doesn't have use for that. He wants to talk about policy ideas, the movement, how we're going to actually make change for people. And so I get why I'm not excited about it. I don't do cable news anymore. So I certainly understand why Bernie Sanders thinks that, there are better uses of his time. But I think that you have to find all the people where they're at, and there is an audience there, and unfortunately, it's a disproportionately elite audience, and unfortunately, elite audiences still very much control a lot of the information flow in the country. So, if to the extent that that I was able to offer any advice there, I'd advocate for a more aggressive, higher risk mainstream media approach than what's been taken so far.
You've just watched a Michael Brooks show video, and you can watch all of our full main live shows every Tuesday night at around 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and subscribe to get all of the clips you want. We're covering the globe. We're focusing on international relations, the intellectual dark web. We're having fun. We're doing deep dives with a lot of amazing guests. Of course, become a patron for the whole thing at patreon.com/TMBS, or subscribe to this YouTube channel and help us keep growing and get that content out there. Subscribe below.